Port Harcourt, January 12. An APC professionals group based in Oyo State stood before reporters and made an accusation that, if true, would rewrite everything Rivers watchers thought they understood about the state's power map. They said the sitting governor, Siminalayi Fubara, was secretly funding his predecessor's faction. Not his allies' faction, his enemy's faction. The man Fubara was supposedly bankrolling was Rotimi Amaechi. The same Amaechi's loyalists, weeks later, would be the ones bleeding on a rural road while the governor's government said nothing. Something does not add up here. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why almost nobody in Rivers State politics is telling you the full picture. Possibly because almost nobody has it. Most channels gave you the headline, "Rivers crisis continues," and moved on. We stay until we find the architecture underneath it. If you have never been here before, you just found the channel that tells you what the headline was designed to hide. Subscribe, because what comes next is the part neither camp wants you connecting. The moment an accusation of secret alliance and an act of political violence point in two completely different directions, and only one of them can be true. Let's build this in order. On Sunday, January 11th, the APC professionals group, led by its convener Alhaji Adekunle Lawal, held a meeting in Oyo State. The outcome was a public statement issued the following day, January 12th. The claim? Governor Fubara was sponsoring the APC faction loyal to Rotimi Amaechi inside Rivers State, and that this sponsorship had become visible through the faction spokesperson, Darlington Nwauju, who had reportedly been speaking on Fubara's behalf during an ongoing impeachment dispute. The group's warning to APC leaders nationally was blunt. Don't trust Fubara's support for Tinubu's 2027 re-election bid because he's playing both sides. 5 days later, on January 17th, Amaechi made his own public move, but it pointed in the opposite direction from an alliance. Speaking publicly, he warned Fubara directly that the wave of popular sympathy the governor was riding really wasn't about Fubara at all. It was about Wike. People didn't love Fubara. They hated Wike, and Fubara was simply the available vessel for that hatred. That is not the language of a man speaking about his beneficiary. That is the language of a man keeping his distance. By February, the pattern shifts again, and this time it gets physical. ADC members were allegedly attacked during a sensitization event in Iguruta, in Ikwere local government area, the same LGC where Amaechi's hometown of Ubima sits. Then comes Friday, March 6th. Amaechi was traveling the Ubima-Umwana road to complete his formal registration as a member of the African Democratic Party, the party he defected to after losing the APC presidential ticket fight. Hours before he arrived, in the early morning of that morning, the ADC's ward office in Ubima was set on fire. Then, along the route, his convoy was ambushed. Security personnel escorting him were fired on first according to the ADC's account and responded. The Ikwere local government chairman, Charles Wobodo, gave a different version entirely. He said his OSPAC vigilante unit was conducting routine checks and that it was Amaechi's security detail that opened fire on his men, injuring one. Two irreconcilable accounts of the same morning. We come to that contradiction in a moment. That is March 6th. By March 9th, the ADC was standing before journalists demanding Wobodo's arrest, and Rivers civil society groups were asking a sharper question: where was the governor? So here's the timing question. Why does an accusation of secret funding surface in January only for the accused beneficiaries' people to be attacked on a rural road in March, with the alleged funder's government conspicuously silent about it? The electoral calendar gives us the frame. A next revised 2027 timetable requires political parties to resolve their primaries and internal disputes between April 23rd and May 30th, 2026. January and February are positioning months when factions test loyalties, float accusations, and probe who's vulnerable before the formal primary battles begin. An accusation like the one from APC professionals in January doesn't need to be true to be useful. It plants a seed of suspicion about Fubara inside his own new party, APC, at precisely the moment he needs that party's trust to secure a second-term ticket. But if the accusation in January was designed to isolate Fubara by painting him as duplicitous, the March attack on Amaechi's convoy did something else entirely. It created a security and accountability story that, fairly or not, lands on Fubara's desk as Rivers State's chief security officer, regardless of who actually ordered it.
Historical echo. Rivers State politics has run this exact predecessor-successor cycle before. Amaechi inherited the governorship from a fractured PDP structure, fell out violently with his own successor, Wike, and Wike in turn helped install Fubara, only to fall out with him just as violently. Each transition produces the same shape: an early honeymoon, a slow accusation campaign about loyalty and secret arrangements, and eventually physical confrontation involving party offices or assembly buildings. The 2023 burning of the State House of Assembly complex during the Fubara-Wike fallout is the most direct precedent for what happened to the ADC's Ubima office in March. But here's where the version you've been given so far starts to wobble. What if the January accusation and the March attack aren't actually about the same relationship at all? What if Fubara is secretly backing Amaechi was never really about Fubara and Amaechi, and was actually a weapon aimed at a third person entirely, someone whose name hasn't come up yet in this video? Let's open the evidence. What was claimed publicly? In plain terms, Governor Fubara is secretly funding and coordinating with the APC faction loyal to Rotimi Amaechi, using spokesperson Darlington Nwauju as the visible face of that arrangement in order to undermine the mainline APC leadership's preferred candidate during the impeachment dispute. What the evidence actually shows: a statement from a regional APC professionals group based not in Rivers but in Oyo State, asserting this as a fact without producing any document, financial record, communication, or named witness. No bank transfer, no intercepted message, no on-record admission from Nwauju himself, from Fubara's office, or from Amaechi. The claim's only support is the assertion itself, repeated by the group that made it. Now, place that beside the March 6th evidence. On that day, the people allegedly connected to Fubara through this secret funding arrangement, Amaechi's ADC faction, were the ones whose office was burned and whose convoy was shot at. If Fubara were genuinely bankrolling Amaechi's political operation, the events of March 6th would represent an attack on his own asset. That is, at the minimum, an enormous gap between the claim and what subsequently happened on the ground. Read that again slowly. The man accused in January of secretly protecting and funding Amaechi's faction was by March the governor under whose watch and under whose silence that same faction's people were attacked, and whose security agencies the ADC had to publicly beg for action. The relevant standard here isn't a legal one, it's a basic evidentiary one. An allegation made by a political faction about a rival political actor with zero supporting documentation carries no more evidentiary weight than a press release, because that is exactly what it is. The Rivers Liberation Movement, a civil society group, made the same observation in different language on March 9th, pointing out that the silence following the Ubima attack was itself disturbing, precisely because a chief security officer with something to hide about his own loyalties would arguably move fastest to be seen condemning an attack on the people he's accused of secretly protecting. If what I just laid out changes how you see this story, drop a comment right now. I want to know where you stood before this video. Did you assume Fubara and Amaechi were quietly working together? Because what comes next is going to change it again. Let's talk about what this actually does for each player. Not legally, but strategically. For Wike's camp, the January accusation does three things simultaneously. First, it manufactures distrust of Fubara inside APC at the exact moment Fubara needs that party's backing for a 2027 ticket, without Wike's camp having to say a word directly. Second, It frames any future cooperation between Fubara and Amaechi-aligned figures, even incidental cooperation, as proof of a pre-existing conspiracy. Third, it sets up a justification for APC's national leadership to install screening committees and processes like the one chaired by Imo State Governor Hope Uzodimma that can be used to filter out Fubara-aligned candidates under the cover of loyalty concerns rather than open factional warfare. For Amaechi, the March attack, regardless of who actually ordered it, does something almost inverse. It reinforces his position as the wronged party in Rivers politics for the third consecutive gubernatorial cycle, generates sympathy and media attention for the ADC at a moment when the party had no declared governorship candidate, and forces every other actor, Fubara included, to either condemn the attack, defend it, or stay silent, each of which carries political costs.
For Fubara, the man named in both stories without directly causing either, the position is now precarious on multiple fronts. First, the legal and party front. He is operating inside APC as a December 2025 defector, dependent on the goodwill of a leadership that a regional faction has just told to distrust him. Second, the public accountability front. As governor, he now owns the optics of the Ubina attack, whether or not his administration had anything to do with it, because security failures default to the executive. Third, the Godfather front. His fallout with Wike, reportedly framed by Tinubu's intervention as a father and son matter, remains unresolved, with Wike publicly describing backing Fubara's second term as political suicide for himself. Everything I just told you about the political calculation assumes one thing is true, that the January accusation and the March attack are connected at all, that they are part of one coordinated strategy by one actor. I want to test that assumption now. What if they are not connected? What if Rivers State in 2026 has simply become a place where multiple actors, independently and for their own reasons, are each generating chaos that happens to look coordinated from the outside but isn't? Zoom out, and this stops being a story about three men. What Rivers demonstrates, again, is how easily unverified factional accusations issued by groups with no direct stake in the immediate dispute, like an Oyo-based APC professional body commenting on Rivers politics, can enter the political bloodstream and shape how national party leadership treats a sitting governor without any evidentiary process at all. That is not a Rivers problem. That is a structural feature of how Nigerian intra-party politics absorbs and launders rumor into concern, which then becomes the basis for screening decisions, ticket denials, and factional realignments, decisions that affect millions of voters who never see the original, unsubstantiated claim. To the diaspora audience watching this, Rivers State's oil revenue allocation through FAAC makes this dispute matter well beyond Nigeria's borders. Every cycle of instability here, assembly buildings burned in 2023, party offices burned in 2026, becomes a data point in how international investors, oil majors, and ratings agencies assess political risk in Nigeria's most economically significant state. The reputational exposure here isn't just domestic. It's the kind of instability that shows up in risk assessments written in London and Houston. Now, the strongest case against everything I've just argued. If the January accusation against Fubara is true, if he genuinely was, even informally, providing some form of support or cover to Amaechi-aligned figures inside APC, then the silence after the March attack takes on a very different meaning. It would not be the silence of an innocent man failing to defend an ally. It could be the silence of someone caught between two commitments he can't publicly reconcile, an informal arrangement with one Amaechi-aligned faction and an inability to act against whatever forces, possibly tied to the Ikwere LG chairman, possibly tied to entirely separate local grievances, carried out the March attack on a different part of that same broader coalition. It's also worth being honest about the chilling effect of accusations like the January statement, even unproven ones. In Nigerian intra-party politics, an accusation of double-dealing doesn't need a tribunal or a court case to have consequences. It can quietly cost a politician committee positions, screening favor, or ticket access with no formal process the accused can even challenge. That is a real cost imposed without evidence, and it should concern anyone who cares about how political accountability is supposed to work. And here's a data point that complicates the clean narrative in either direction. Despite the scale of documented violence in Rivers State since 2023, the 2023 Assembly Complex bombing, the 2025 state of emergency, the alleged extra budgetary spending exceeding 800 billion naira during Fubara suspension, and now the March 2026 Ubima attack, virtually none of these incidents have produced a completed prosecution or formal accountability outcome. The pattern in Rivers is allegation, outrage, news cycle, and then quiet. If that pattern holds, neither the January accusation nor the March attack may ever be formally resolved at all. The real battle is in the next 2 to 3 months, as primaries conclude under INEC's late May deadline, and I do not know yet who is winning it.
So where does this go from here? Path 1. The January accusation fades, unprosecuted and unresolved, exactly like every prior Rivers controversy, and Fubara proceeds toward the 2027 ticket bid inside APC, with this allegation simply sitting in the background as ammunition for his rivals to revive whenever convenient. Path 2. The March attack investigation, if it happens at all, produces evidence that the Ikwere local government chairman acted on instructions from someone above him in Fubara's government structure, which would transform the secret alliance accusation into something closer to its opposite, proof that Fubara's government was actively working against Amaechi's faction, not for it. Path 3, the one that ends the current arrangement entirely. Amaechi, having now publicly refused to align with either Fubara or Wike, uses the ADC's growing profile from the Ubima attack to position the party as the actual beneficiary of the Fubara-Wike collapse, absorbing disaffected defectors from both camps, including potentially Fubara himself, ahead of the late May primary deadline. 3 signals to watch. First, does the Rivers State Police Command, or DSS, issue any formal statement on the Ubima investigation in the coming weeks? If they do, watch whether Ubodo is named or cleared. That tells you whether the security apparatus is independent of the governor's office on this question. If months pass with no statement at all, that silence becomes its own answer about where accountability currently sits in Rivers State. Second, does Fubara's office issue any condemnation, even a delayed one, of the March 6th attack? If he does, watch the language. Does he name Ubodo, or does he speak in vague terms about unfortunate incidents? If he never addresses it at all, ask why a sitting governor would avoid commenting on an attack on a former governor's convoy in his own state. Third, as the April 23rd to May 30th primary window closes, watch whether any ADC governorship candidate emerges in Rivers, and watch specifically whether that candidate comes from inside the existing Fubara or Wike camps. If a defector from either camp surfaces inside the ADC, that confirms Amaechi's party is functioning as the third option analysts predicted in late March. If no candidate emerges and the ADC stays dormant in the governorship race, that tells you Amaechi's stated neutrality is genuine, not a staging ground. At the beginning of this video, I told you about an accusation from January that painted Fubara as Amaechi's secret patron, and an attack in March that left Amaechi's people bleeding on a road while Fubara's government said nothing. The deeper truth is that these two events may never have been about each other at all. The January accusation may have been aimed less at exposing a real alliance and more at manufacturing distrust in Fubara's own new party, ahead of a primary season where that distrust is currency.
and the March attack may say less about any of the three named men and more about how thin the chain of command and accountability has become at the local government level in Rivers State, where a local government chairman can become the center of a national political controversy with almost no scrutiny of his own role. Watch for any police or DSS statement on the Ubima investigation before the end of July. If 3 months pass with nothing, that silence will tell you more about who actually controls accountability in Rivers State than any of the accusations in this video. What this means beyond Rivers is that when allegations without evidence can shape national party decisions, and when attacks on political offices can go uninvestigated for months, the cost isn't paid by the politicians named in the headlines. It's paid by everyone whose vote in 2027 will be decided by candidates chosen through exactly this kind of accountable process. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight will never be told, that the secret alliance story and the Ubima attack story may point in opposite directions, and that almost no one covering this has put them side by side. If this changed how you read the Rivers crisis, share it with someone who's been following this story and tell them which path you think is actually unfolding. That's how accountability starts, not with outrage, but with people connecting the pieces nobody bothered to.
This is Naija Unmasked. Nothing stays hidden here. I'll see you in the next one.